Commander Jake Morrison pressed his face against the cold metal window of the New Horizons spaceship and watched the massive space station grow larger in front of them. Nexus Prime looked like a giant crystal floating in the darkness of space, with thousands of lights blinking across its surface. This was it, the moment humanity had been waiting for since they first left Earth and started building colonies on other planets. Jake felt his heart beating fast in his chest. After 300 years of living alone in their corner of the galaxy, humans were finally going to meet other intelligent life forms. The radio messages had been going back and forth for months, setting up this first meeting with something called the Galactic Confederation. Behind him, Ambassador Lisa Grant was going through her presentation one more time. She had spent years preparing for this moment, learning what little they knew about alien customs and trying to figure out how to make humans look good to these new neighbors. Her hands shook slightly as she held the data tablet that contained pictures and videos of human civilization. "Are you ready for this?" Jake asked her. Lisa looked up from her notes and gave him a nervous smile. "As ready as anyone can be when meeting aliens for the first time. I just hope they like what they see." The space station was bigger than any human city. Ships of strange shapes and sizes moved around it like metal fish swimming through water. Some looked like they were made of glass. Others had wings that seemed to glow with their own light. Jake had never imagined that spaceships could look so different from the simple metal boxes that humans built. "New Horizon, you are cleared for docking Bay 7. Please follow the guidance lights," came a voice over the radio. It spoke perfect English, though it sounded like it was coming from a very large throat. As their ship moved into the docking bay, Jake could see aliens working on the station through the windows. They were tall and covered in scales that changed color in the light, moving with smooth motions that reminded him of snakes. These must be the HFY, the ones who seem to be in charge of the military forces in this part of the galaxy. The docking bay was huge, easily 10 times bigger than anything humans had ever built. Their ship looked like a toy compared to some of the other vessels parked there. Jake started to feel very small and very far from home. An hour later, they were walking through corridors that seemed to be made of living crystal. The walls pulsed with soft light, and the air smelled like flowers mixed with something sharp and metallic. Ambassador Grant walked beside Jake, carrying her presentation materials and trying not to stare at the aliens they passed. The aliens stared back at them, though. Jake noticed how they whispered to each other and pointed at the humans. Some looked curious, others seemed worried or disgusted. He wondered what they were thinking about these strange new creatures who had come from so far away. The meeting room was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness high above them. Representatives from dozens of different species sat in chairs that looked like they had grown from the floor itself. At the center of the room, on a raised platform, sat the most impressive alien Jake had ever seen. General Zethkar was 9 feet tall and covered in scales that shifted from deep blue to bright silver as he moved. His eyes were large and yellow, with pupils that were thin black lines. When he spoke, his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Welcome to Nexus Prime, humans. We are curious to learn about your species and your place in this galaxy." Ambassador Grant stepped forward and began her presentation. She talked about human history, their art and music, their science and technology. She showed pictures of Earth's green forests and blue oceans, of human cities reaching toward the sky, of families and children playing in parks. The alien audience seemed interested but not impressed. Jake could see them exchanging looks that suggested they thought human technology was simple and primitive compared to their own. When Grant started talking about human colonies and how they survived on distant planets, a few aliens in the audience started to pay more attention. "Our people are very good at adapting to new environments," Grant explained. "We have learned to use every resource available to us, including developing sustainable food sources that can grow anywhere." She pressed a button on her tablet, and a holographic image appeared in the center of the room. It showed human farms with neat rows of crops, but also large buildings where insects were raised for food. The image zoomed in to show crickets, beetles, and grubs being harvested and processed into protein bars and nutritious meals. The reaction was immediate and terrible. Several aliens made sounds of disgust and covered their faces with their hands or tentacles or whatever they used instead of hands. Others stood up from their chairs and backed away from the holographic display, as if it might contaminate them just by being there. General Zethkar's scales turned a dark red, color that Jake somehow knew meant anger or revulsion. The great alien leader leaned forward and stared at the humans with his yellow eyes. "You eat insects," he said, and his voice was full of disgust. "Your people consume bugs like animals scavenging for scraps." The whispers around the room grew louder. Jake heard words being translated by his earpiece. Primitive, savage, disgusting. Ambassador Grant tried to explain that insect protein was efficient and sustainable, that it had helped humanity survive during difficult times, but no one was listening anymore. "Bug eaters," hissed one of the HFY advisors, and the word spread through the chamber like fire. The humans are bug eaters. What had started as a diplomatic meeting quickly became a trial. The Galactic Confederation's council spent the next hour discussing what to do with these new arrivals, who had such disgusting habits. Jake watched as humanity's hopes for joining the galactic community crumbled around them. In the end, the decision was announced by General Zethkar himself. Humans would be granted the lowest possible membership in the Confederation. They could trade for basic supplies and fuel, but they were forbidden from accessing advanced technology or establishing new colonies without permission. They would be monitored and restricted, treated like children who could not be trusted with dangerous toys. As they walked back to their ship, Ambassador Grant looked defeated. 30 years of preparation, she whispered, and it all came down to the fact that we eat insects. Jake put his hand on her shoulder. Maybe things will change with time. Maybe they will learn to see us differently. But as their ship left the crystal station and headed back toward human space, Jake could not shake the feeling that they had just made enemies instead of friends. The word bug eaters echoed in his mind, and he knew that this was how the galaxy would remember them. 30 years had passed since that terrible day at Nexus Prime, and Carl Jensen still felt angry every morning when he woke up in his small metal room on the mining world of Kepler 442b. Outside his window, he could see human workers loading heavy containers of rare crystals onto HFY transport ships. The aliens paid almost nothing for materials that were worth millions in the galaxy's markets, but humans had no choice but to accept whatever they were offered. Carl pulled on his work clothes and walked to the mining site, where 200 humans worked every day in conditions that would have killed most alien species. The planet's air was thin and cold, and the gravity was stronger than Earth's, making every step feel like walking through thick mud. But humans were tough, and they had learned to survive in places where other species could not. At the work site, Carl found his crew already digging into a new vein of quantum crystals. These materials were used to power the HFY's most advanced weapons, but the aliens never told the humans what they were mining. They just pointed to spots on the ground and said, "Dig." "Morning, boss," called out Pete Walsh, a young man whose father had been killed in a mining accident the year before. The HFY supervisors had not even bothered to investigate the death, just ordered the body removed so work could continue. Carl nodded and picked up his own digging tools. As the foreman, he could have stayed in his office and filled out paperwork, but he preferred working alongside his people. It helped him remember that they were all in this together, trapped on a world that felt more like a prison than a workplace. Around midday, a HFY transport ship landed near the mining site. Out stepped Inspector Vexicol, a particularly cruel alien who seemed to enjoy making humans feel small and worthless. His scales were always polished to a bright shine, and he wore a uniform covered in metals that probably meant nothing, but were designed to impress lesser species. "Humans," Vexicol announced in his booming voice, "you will increase production by 20% starting tomorrow. The Confederation requires more materials for an important project." Carl stepped forward, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. "Sir, we are already working 14 hours a day. Our people are exhausted and accidents are becoming more common. Perhaps if we had better equipment or more workers." Vexicol's scales turned a dangerous shade of red. "Bug eaters do not make demands. You will find a way to increase production or face consequences." The alien supervisor walked through the mining site, pointing at various pieces of human equipment and declaring them inefficient. He ordered several machines to be removed and sent back to the Confederation, even though these were tools the humans had built themselves and were perfectly suited for the work they were doing. After Vexicol left, Pete Walsh threw his helmet on the ground in frustration. "How long are we supposed to put up with this? We do all the work while they take all the profits and treat us like animals." Carl understood the young man's anger, but he also knew that rebellion would only make things worse. The HFY had warships in orbit around every human world, ready to enforce the Confederation's will if anyone caused trouble. Meanwhile, on the hidden research station orbiting New Geneva Colony, Dr. Helen Baker was working on projects that could change everything. For 25 years, she had been secretly developing new technologies in underground laboratories that the HFY knew nothing about. Her team had made incredible discoveries in quantum physics and biotechnology, but they had to be very careful to hide their work from the alien monitoring systems. The new protein synthesis chambers are working perfectly, reported her assistant, Dr. Kevin Murphy. We can now produce complex organic compounds at 10 times the efficiency of conventional methods. Helen smiled as she looked at the data on her screen. If the galaxy knew what humans were capable of, the balance of power would shift overnight. But revealing their advances too early would just result in the technology being confiscated and the research team being imprisoned. On the patrol ship Defiance, Captain Ben Rodriguez watched through his telescope as another HFY inspection team boarded a human cargo vessel. The aliens would search through every container, looking for anything that might be considered advanced technology or beyond human authorization. Last week, they had confiscated a shipment of medical scanners that were barely more advanced than equipment from Earth's 21st century. The official reason was that the devices contained materials that humans were not permitted to use. But everyone knew the real reason was that the HFY enjoyed showing their power over the bug eaters. Ben's communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Foster, looked up from her station with a grim expression. "Captain, we are receiving a distress call from the frontier world of Harrison's Point. They are reporting a plague outbreak and requesting immediate medical assistance." Ben started to give orders to change course, but then remembered the regulations. Human ships were not permitted to travel between systems without Confederation approval, and getting that approval could take weeks of paperwork and bribes. "Send a message to Confederation Command," Ben ordered reluctantly. "Request permission to deliver medical supplies to Harrison's Point." 3 days later, the response came back. "Request denied. Harrison's Point colony is outside the designated human assistance zone. Local authorities must handle their own medical emergencies." Ben stared at the message in disbelief. There were no local authorities on Harrison's Point except for humans, and they did not have the medicine needed to fight the plague. Without help, thousands of people would die. He sent another message, this time offering to pay for the privilege of saving his own people's lives. The response was even worse than before. Human colonies experiencing difficulties should have planned better for contingencies. The Confederation cannot be responsible for poor decision-making by bug-eater settlements. On Earth's moon, which had become a busy spaceport for human trade ships, teenager Katie Walsh dreamed of becoming a scientist like her heroes Dr. Baker and Dr. Murphy. But she knew that no matter how smart she was or how hard she studied, the universities on the advanced worlds would never accept applications from humans. "Maybe I can study on one of our own world," she told her friend Danny Cooper as they watched alien ships come and go through the port's windows. Danny shook his head sadly. "Human universities are not allowed to teach advanced science or engineering. The Confederation says it is for our own safety, but everyone knows they just want to keep us stupid and weak." Katie pressed her face against the window and watched a beautiful ship with silver wings prepare for departure. The pilot was probably going to see wonders that she could never imagine, visiting worlds with cities made of light and oceans that glowed in the dark. "Someday," she whispered, "things will be different." Back on Kepler 442b, Carl Jensen received news that made his blood run cold. The Confederation had decided to relocate half of the human population to an even more remote mining world with worse working conditions and lower pay. The official reason was increased efficiency, but everyone knew it was punishment for the colony's failure to meet the impossible production quotas. As he looked out at his exhausted workers, Carl made a decision that would have seemed crazy 30 years earlier. He started to organize secret meetings where humans could talk about their situation without fear of alien surveillance. It was dangerous, but doing nothing felt even more dangerous. The galaxy had called them bug-eaters and treated them like slaves for 3 decades. But humans were still alive, still learning, and still getting stronger. Someday, The aliens would discover that they had made a terrible mistake in underestimating the species they had chosen to despise. The first warning came from the deep space monitoring stations at the edge of the galaxy, but nobody paid attention to it at first. The sensors detected massive objects moving through the empty darkness between galaxies, but the readings were so strange that most scientists assumed their equipment was broken. General Vexthar was in his office on Nexus Prime, reviewing reports about human mining operations, when his communications officer burst through the door without permission. The young Kethai's scales were pale with fear, and his voice shook as he spoke. "General, you need to see this immediately. The long-range scanners have detected something impossible." Vexithar looked at the data display and felt his blood turn cold. The objects approaching their galaxy were enormous, some of them bigger than moons, and they were moving faster than anything the Confederation had ever built. Worse, they were heading directly toward the most populated systems. "How many ships are we looking at?" Vexithar asked. "We are not sure they are ships, sir. The energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases, but there appear to be thousands of them, possibly tens of thousands." Within hours, every major world in the Confederation was receiving emergency broadcasts. The Council of Species called an urgent meeting, and representatives from dozens of worlds gathered at Nexus Prime to discuss this new threat. For the first time in decades, humans were invited to participate in the discussions, though they were still seated in the back row like unwelcome guests. Ambassador Lisa Grant, now much older but still serving as humanity's representative, listened as the alien leaders argued about what to do. Some thought the approaching objects were natural phenomena, perhaps asteroids or comets. Others worried they might be weapons sent by an unknown enemy. The answer came 3 days later when the first wave of objects reached the outer planets of the Rigel system. They were not natural at all, but machines of incredible complexity and power. Each one looked different from the others, as if they had been built by adding pieces over thousands of years. Some had metal arms that reached out like the tentacles of a sea creature, while others were covered in spikes and weapons that glowed with deadly energy. The Confederation's defense fleet moved to intercept them, confident that their advanced weapons and energy shields would make short work of these ancient machines. Admiral Keshvar led the attack with 500 of the most powerful warships ever built, each one capable of destroying a small moon. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes. The alien machines did not use energy weapons or missiles like normal ships. Instead, they fired beams of pure destruction that passed through the Confederation's shields as if they did not exist. When these beams touched a ship's hull, the metal simply disappeared, turning into empty space. Entire vessels vanished in seconds, along with everyone aboard them. Admiral Keshavar's flagship, the Pride of Kethai, lasted longer than most because of its extra thick armor and multiple shield generators. But even this mighty ship was helpless against weapons that ignored every defense the aliens had ever created. The last message from the bridge was a desperate plea for help that cut off in the middle of a word. Back on Nexus Prime, the surviving leaders of the Confederation watched in horror as their most powerful fleet was completely destroyed. General Vexthar's hand shook as he read the casualty reports. 50,000 of the best soldiers in the galaxy had been wiped out without managing to damage a single enemy machine. "What are these things?" demanded Senator Kexval from the crystalline world of Andros. The answer came from the ancient archives deep in the station's memory banks. A computer that had not been accessed for 3,000 years suddenly activated and began playing a recording that made everyone in the room fall silent with terror. The recording showed scenes from the distant past when the galaxy was younger and full of different species. Great cities covered entire planets, and massive ships traveled between the stars carrying millions of people. But then came the Devourers, machine intelligences that consumed everything in their path, turning living worlds into empty void. "They came from beyond the edge of reality," said the voice in the recording, spoken by a species that no longer existed. "They ate our worlds, our people, our very atoms. We fought them for 1,000 years, but nothing could stop them. In the end, we could only drive them away into the dark between galaxies, hoping they would never return." The recording explained that the Devourers were not just machines, but something far worse, a combination of mechanical intelligence and organic hunger that had evolved over millions of years. They did not destroy for conquest or revenge, but because they needed to consume matter and energy to continue. Existing President Martha Collins was sitting in her office on Earth when the emergency message arrived from Nexus Prime. For the first time in 30 years, the Confederation was asking humans for help, not as servants or laborers, but as equals who might have ideas that could save the galaxy. The message was brief and desperate. All member species must contribute immediately to the defense effort. Previous restrictions on human technology development are temporarily suspended. Please send your best military leaders and scientists to Nexus Prime at once. Martha looked out her window at the blue sky of Earth and wondered if her grandchildren would ever see it again. The reports from Rigel were terrifying. Entire star systems being consumed by machines that seemed unstoppable. But humans had survived worse things before, and they were not going to give up now. Admiral Steve Parker received his orders while his ship was patrolling near the Mars colonies. He was to take the fastest vessel available and travel to Nexus Prime immediately, bringing with him a team of humanity's most experienced military officers. For years, he had been restricted to commanding small patrol ships and cargo escorts. Now he was being asked to help plan the defense of the entire galaxy. During the journey to Nexus Prime, Steve studied every piece of information they had about the Devourers. The machines seemed to be completely invulnerable to conventional weapons, but there had to be a weakness somewhere. Everything that existed could be destroyed. It was just a matter of finding the right method. When he arrived at the station, Steve found chaos and panic everywhere. Alien leaders who had spent centuries believing they were the masters of the galaxy were now faced with an enemy they could not understand or defeat. The proud Kethai generals looked like frightened children, desperately asking anyone who would listen for ideas about how to fight the Devourers. In the war room, Steve sat at a table surrounded by beings who had treated humans like animals for 30 years. Now they hung on his every word, hoping that the bug-eaters might have some insight that could save them all. "What do you know about their weaknesses?" asked General Vexthar, his voice humble for the first time in his life. Steve looked at the data displays showing the Devourers' steady advance toward the core worlds. 2 more systems had already fallen, and millions of people were fleeing toward the center of the galaxy. At their current speed, the machines would reach the most populated worlds within weeks. "I do not know yet," Steve admitted, "but I promise you this. Humans will find a way to fight them. We have been underestimated before, and we have always found a way to survive." As he spoke, Dr. Helen Baker's secret research team was already working around the clock in their hidden laboratories, studying the Devourer technology and looking for any possible weakness. What they would discover would change the course of the war and the fate of every living being in the galaxy. Colonel Nancy Wright had volunteered for what everyone believed was a suicide mission, but she was not afraid as her small ship approached the edge of Devourer territory. Her vessel, the Phantom Runner, was built using technology that Dr. Baker's team had developed in secret over the past 25 years. Instead of metal and plastic, most of the ship's important parts were grown from modified organic materials that looked and acted like living tissue. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Nancy would try to get close enough to a Devourer ship to scan it and learn how these ancient machines actually worked. Previous attempts by Confederation forces had failed because the enemy's sensors could detect traditional technology from millions of kilometers away. But the Phantom Runner registered on scanners as a small biological life form, not a spacecraft. As she drifted through the debris field that had once been the planet Xerion, Nancy could see the Devourers at work. The machines moved like metal sharks through the wreckage, their long arms reaching out to grab chunks of matter and pull them into glowing chambers in their bodies. Everything they touched simply disappeared, converted into energy that powered their endless hunger. "This is incredible," Nancy whispered into her recorder as she watched a Devourer consume what looked like the remains of a city. "They are not just destroying things, they are eating them at the atomic level." One of the smaller machines drifted past her ship, its sensors scanning the area for anything useful to consume. Nancy held her breath as the creature examined her vessel, but after a few seconds it moved on. To its mechanical mind, she was just another piece of space debris, too small to be worth the energy required to process it. For 3 days, Nancy followed the Devourers as they methodically stripped every useful material from the dead system. She recorded everything she saw and transmitted the data back to Dr. Baker's laboratory, using organic communication methods that the machines could not detect. What she learned changed everything. The Devourers were not pure machines as everyone had assumed. Hidden inside their metal shells were organic components that looked almost like biological organs. These living parts seemed to be responsible for processing the matter the machines consumed, breaking it down into the basic elements they needed to repair and reproduce themselves. More importantly, Nancy discovered that the organic components required specific types of proteins to function properly. Without these proteins, the biological systems would break down, and the machines would become helpless metal shells drifting in space. When Nancy returned to Nexus Prime with her recordings, Dr. Baker's analysis team worked without sleep for 48 hours to understand what they had learned. The breakthrough came when Dr. Kevin Murphy realized that the proteins the Devourers needed were the same compounds found in Earth's insects, the very creatures that had made humans outcasts in galactic society. It makes perfect sense, Helen explained to the assembled War Council. 3,000 years ago, when the Devourers first attacked this galaxy, most species probably still used organic food sources. But over time, everyone moved to synthetic nutrition and artificial proteins. The Devourers adapted by developing systems that could extract what they needed from any organic matter, but they still require the original biological compounds to survive. General Vexthar leaned forward, his scales showing the deep blue color that indicated intense concentration. Are you saying that these machines can be poisoned? Not exactly poisoned, Helen replied, but we have discovered that certain protein chains found abundantly in insect biology are toxic to their organic systems. If we can deliver enough of these compounds to their biological components, we can shut down their ability to process matter and energy. Admiral Steve Parker studied the research data with growing excitement. After weeks of feeling helpless against an unstoppable enemy, they finally had something that might work. How quickly can we produce weapons using these compounds? That is the beautiful part, Helen said with a smile. We do not need to produce anything new. Human colonies across the galaxy already have massive insect farms for food production. We can extract what we need from our existing agriculture and convert it into biological weapons within days. The first test came when Captain Ben Rodriguez led a small strike force against a group of Devourer scouts near the abandoned mining world of Kepler 442b. His ships carried specially modified missiles, loaded with concentrated insect proteins that had been processed into an aerosol form. Ben felt his heart racing as his ship approached the enemy machines. These were the same creatures that had destroyed the entire Confederation fleet at Rigel without taking any damage at all. But now humans had a weapon that might actually work. All ships fire on my command, Ben ordered over the radio. Target the largest machine first. The missiles streaked through space and struck the Devourer's hull, releasing clouds of organic compounds that seeped through tiny gaps in the machine's armor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the creature began to shudder and shake as if it was having some kind of mechanical seizure. The glowing chambers inside the machine started to flicker and dim. The long metal arms that had been reaching out to grab debris suddenly went limp and fell to its sides. Within minutes, the massive Devourer was nothing more than a dead piece of metal drifting through space. It worked, Ben shouted over the radio. The biological weapon actually worked. Word of the victory spread through the surviving Confederation forces like wildfire. For the first time since the invasion began, they had proof that the Devourers could be killed. More importantly, the weapon that could destroy them came from the very people the galaxy had scorned as primitive bug-eaters. General Vexthar personally contacted President Martha Collins to request an emergency meeting. When the call came through, Martha was in the middle of touring an insect farm on Mars, watching workers harvest protein from millions of crickets and beetles. President Collins, Vexthar said, and his voice sounded very different from the arrogant tone he had used for 30 years. The Confederation formally requests that humanity share their biological weapons technology with all member species. We are prepared to offer significant compensation and concessions in exchange for this assistance. Martha looked out at the insect farms that stretched to the horizon and smiled. We will consider your request, General. But first, we need to discuss some changes to humanity's status in the Confederation. Meanwhile, Engineer Pete Morrison was working around the clock to retrofit alien warships with human biological weapon systems. The proud Kethai officers who had once refused to let humans touch their precious technology now begged him to work faster. How long before we can equip the entire fleet? asked Captain Zexmore, a HFY officer who had spent years insulting human intelligence. Pete wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the alien with satisfaction. That depends on how much cooperation we get from your people. These systems are complex and they require constant maintenance by trained technicians. Whatever you need, Zexmore replied quickly. Money, materials, personnel, just tell us what it will take. As more and more ships were equipped with the insect-derived weapons, the tide of the war began to turn. The Devourers, who had seemed unstoppable just weeks before, started falling back as human-led fleets pushed them away from the populated worlds. But the real test was yet to come. Deep Space Scouts had detected the Devourer mothership, a construct the size of a small moon that seemed to be the source of all the other machines. If they could destroy that, the invasion would be over, but it would take the combined fleets of every species in the galaxy to have any chance of success. And leading that final battle would be the Bug-Eaters who had found a way to save them all. Admiral Steve Parker stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned warship Humanity's Pride, watching as the largest fleet in galactic history assembled around him. Ships from every species in the Confederation had come together for this final battle against the Devourer mothership. And for the first time in anyone's memory, human vessels were not at the back of the formation. The mothership hung in space like a metal planet, its surface covered with thousands of weapons and defensive systems. It was so large that it had its own gravity field, and smaller Devourer machines orbited around it like deadly moons. Intelligence reports suggested that destroying this central hub would shut down all the other machines across the galaxy. All fleet commanders. This is Admiral Parker, Steve announced over the communication system. Today we fight not as separate species but as one people defending our home. The weapon systems you carry were developed by humans, but they belong to all of us now. General Vexithar's voice came over the radio from his command ship, and Steve could hear the respect in his tone. Admiral Parker, the HFY fleet stands ready to follow your orders. We are honored to serve under your command. It was a moment that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. The proud military leaders of the Confederation were taking orders from a species they had called Bug-Eaters, and they were grateful for the privilege. The battle began when the first wave of fighters launched their biological weapons at the mothership's outer defenses. The insect-derived compounds worked just as well on the larger machines, causing defensive turrets to shut down and armor plates to fall away like dead skin. Captain Ben Rodriguez led his squadron through the gaps in the mothership's defenses, dodging energy beams and missile swarms as they searched for critical targets. I have visual on what looks like a main reactor, he reported. It is heavily shielded, but I think we can get through. Behind him, the main fleet pressed forward with HFY battleships and human cruisers fighting side by side. The aliens had quickly learned to respect human tactics and technology, while humans had gained access to advanced shields and weapons that made their ships far more effective. Dr. Helen Baker watched the battle from her command center on Nexus Prime, monitoring the effectiveness of the biological weapons and making adjustments as needed. Her life's work was finally being put to the ultimate test, and so far the results were better than she had dared to hope. The mothership's biological systems are failing faster than we expected, she reported to Admiral Parker. It seems like the concentration of organic compounds in such a large machine makes it even more vulnerable to our weapons. The turning point came when Colonel Nancy Wright, now promoted to lead the Special Operations Division, managed to penetrate the mothership's core with a small team of volunteers. They planted biological weapons directly into the creature's central processing system, flooding its organic components with toxic insect proteins. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The massive mothership began to convulse and shake as its systems shut down one by one. The smaller machines that had been orbiting around it suddenly went dark and began drifting away like dead fish in an ocean current. It is working, Nancy reported over her radio. The biological components are breaking down throughout the entire structure. I think we have killed it. Within hours, reports were coming in from across the galaxy. Every Devourer machine had stopped functioning simultaneously, leaving nothing but empty metal shells floating in space. The ancient enemy that had threatened to consume all life in the galaxy had been defeated by creatures it had considered too primitive to notice. In the weeks that followed, the political structure of the Confederation changed completely. Humanity was not only granted full membership, but was asked to take a leadership role in the organization. The species that had been restricted to menial labor were suddenly the most important people in the galaxy. President Martha Collins addressed the Confederation, assembly from the same chamber where humans had been humiliated 30 years earlier. This time she spoke from the central platform while alien representatives listened respectfully from their seats. "We do not seek revenge for the past," Martha said, her voice carrying clearly through the Great Hall, "but we do expect the respect and recognition that our contributions have earned. The galaxy called us bug-eaters, and we have proven that sometimes the things others find disgusting are exactly what they need to survive." General Vexthar approached Admiral Parker after the ceremony, his scales showing the humble blue pattern that indicated deep respect. "Admiral, the Kethai military would be honored if you would accept the position of Supreme Commander of Confederation Defense Forces." Steve looked at the alien who had once treated humans like animals and nodded slowly. "I will consider your offer, General, but understand that if I accept, things will be very different from now on. Humans remember how we were treated, and we will not allow any species to be oppressed the way we were." Dr. Helen Baker became the Confederation's chief scientific advisor, with unlimited funding to continue her research into biological technologies. The insect farms that had once been a source of shame for humanity were now recognized as the most strategically important installations in the galaxy. Captain Ben Rodriguez was given command of the new Joint Defense Fleet, with ships and crews from every member species serving under his authority. The young man who had once been forced to submit to alien inspections now had the power to protect entire star systems. On Earth's moon, Katie Walsh received acceptance letters from universities across the galaxy, all competing for the chance to educate one of humanity's brilliant young minds. The teenager who had once dreamed of exploring the stars now had her choice of any career she wanted. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Carl Jensen received a visit from Inspector Vexcall on the mining world of Kepler 442b. The Kethai official who had once treated human workers like slaves now came bearing contracts that offered fair wages and good working conditions. "The Confederation wishes to apologize for past misunderstandings," Vexcall said, his voice humble and nervous. "We hope that humans will continue to work with us in developing these important mineral resources." Carl looked at the alien who had made his life miserable for so many years and smiled. "We will consider your offer, Inspector. But the days of humans working for almost nothing are over. If you want our help, you will pay us what our work is actually worth." As the months passed, the galaxy settled into a new normal. Human colonies expanded rapidly, with advanced technology that had been forbidden to them for decades. The insect farms grew larger and more sophisticated, producing not just food, but the biological compounds that were now essential for galactic security. Children who had grown up hearing the word bug-eater as an insult now learned that it was a title of honor. The creatures that other species found disgusting had saved them all from extinction, and the people who raised and harvested those insects were the heroes of the galaxy. Admiral Parker stood once again on the observation deck of a human ship, but this time he was looking out at a very different galaxy. Human vessels patrolled the trade routes alongside alien ships, protecting commerce and keeping the peace. The species that had once been considered too primitive for civilized society were now the guardians of civilization itself. The galaxy had called them bug-eaters in scorn, never imagining that those same bugs would one day be the key to their salvation. And now, as alien leaders came to human worlds seeking advice and assistance, they spoke the word with reverence and gratitude. They had learned too late that the species they had scorned possessed exactly what they needed to survive. And in the years to come, they would indeed pray for humanity's continued mercy, knowing that their fate rested in the hands of the people they had chosen to despise. The bug-eaters had inherited the galaxy, and they would not soon forget the lessons they had learned about the price of prejudice and the value of humility.